Hello everyone and welcome to another Rook Endgame lesson with Coach B and MasterChess.com. This is the fifth lesson in the Rook Endgame series. In this lesson, I will go over a couple of tactical elements that are quite common in Rook Endgames, and going over them will help you see these type of moves in your games even when you're low on time. As the title of the video suggests, these positions are tactical elements and can be used as tactical problems. I encourage you to pause the video after each new position and think how you would play the given scenario, and then click the play button after that to see the correct continuation. If the variation you thought about is not talked about in the video, I encourage you to visit my website, masterchess.com, click on Endgame versus Computer, Rook Endgames, and then Tactical Elements at the bottom of the page, where you will be able to play your variation against the computer and see why it would not be the best continuation. I'm going to start with the easier positions first, and then they're going to get harder towards the end. So let's get started. In this first position, it's white to play, so I encourage you to pause the video and think about the position, and then press the play button when you are ready. Assuming that you're ready, let's go over it. So here, if you thought about moving the pawn to g6 and trying to promote right away, just because your rook shelters your king from the checks of the black rook, well, this actually only ends in a draw. The reason why, after rook g3, let's say king f7, pawn to a3, pawn to g7, the king will come to c6, getting towards his pawn. And now if you promote your pawn, the rook will be able to take it, the king will take the rook, but now the black king could move to b5, and he's only one square away from defending his pawn, and he will be able to use his pawn to promote it, and you will not be able to prevent it just because your king is so far away. After something like rook to a2, trying to block that pawn from moving, your king can simply just come and defend it. If your king will come towards the pawn, the opponent's king will come and attack your rook. You're going to have to run away, and after he pushes the pawn, you're going to have to stop him from promoting, so rook to g1 does that. But after king to b1, white cannot make any progress. Rook to g2 check will just move the king to b1, and then if you just keep checking the king, this will be a threefold repetition. And obviously if you let him promote the pawn, then you're going to have to sacrifice your rook and reach your draw this way. This position is a win, so let's go back from the beginning. And here, the correct play is rook to f4. After rook to f4, you're attacking black's pawn, and you want to make sure that you are always attacking black's pawn, because that will keep the black rook babysitting the pawn. If it leaves the pawn, then that pawn will be gone. So after this, let's say he's trying the same thing like rook to g3. Well, now you will be able to take black's pawn, and after this, the rook cannot prevent you from promoting your pawn. You're going to reach the Lucena position. After rook to f3, king to g7, king to c7, rook to d4, you could cut off the black king, so the black king cannot come and support you. And then black's rook alone cannot prevent you from reaching the Lucena position and promoting your pawn in the end. So after rook to g3, pawn to g6, rook to f3, king to h8, rook to g3, pawn to g7, rook h3 check, king to g8, and now we've reached the Lucena position. So after rook to g3, for example, king comes out to f7, rook f3 check, king g6, rook g3 check, king f6, rook f3, king g5, rook g3, and now we bring the rook to g4, which is the famous Lucena position. And then after the exchange, white will be able to promote the pawn and win the game from here. And here's our next position. Again, it's white to play, and actually all of these positions I've made it that white is to move, just to make it a little bit easier when you think about these positions. So again, it's always going to be white to move here. So pause your video, think about what you would do, and then hit play after you are ready. Assuming that you thought about this position, the correct play here is king to d6, a discover check on the black king, and now the black king has to move away while you will be able to pick up black's rook and win the game from here. Okay, here's our next position. Again, pause your video, white to move. What would you play? All right, so let's go over it. If you've seen the move rook to b5, nice job. After this move, we are setting up a discover check. Many times when you have the kings in horizontal opposition, you might look for discovered opportunities, especially if you can defend your pawn in one move. So here, if black takes the pawn, then king to b6 wins on the spot, as the black king has to move away, and then we will be able to pick up black's rook. Now, from here, we still want to see how to win this game. After something like king to f3, our best move is rook to b3, defending our pawn and attacking black's king, which will move away. After king to b6, black will probably push the pawn on h4, but we are totally fine taking that pawn. And after something like pawn to g3, we are totally fine taking this pawn, as after black takes, he's not going to be able to prevent us from promoting. We're going to move to h5, and then we're just going to promote our pawn and win the game from here. But coming back from the beginning, after rook to b5, what if black moves the rook to a6? I encourage you to pause the video again and see how you'd play this position. Okay, so let's go over it. So the correct play here is king to b4 check. After this, let's say the black king moves to e4, and now we're going to be able to bring our rook to a5 behind the pawn, and that pawn will be able to promote. Or if black takes that pawn, we're simply going to take the rook and then be able to win the game from here. We saw very similar, bringing the rook on the a3, and then simply taking the pawn on the h file and sacrificing our rook, we will be able to promote the other pawn and win the game. And here's the next position, white to play, find the best move. Okay, assuming that you're ready, let's go over it. So the best play here is pawn to g6. After this, black has two options. If he takes the pawn on g6, then what we have is rook to h1 checkmate. Whenever the king is on the side of the board, you always want to look out for these type of checkmates. And coming back after g6, here if black moves the rook to d8, what we're going to do is push the pawn to g7. And after something like rook to g8, trying to stop that pawn from promoting, king to f5, taking horizontal opposition. After king to h6, king to f6. And now, if the rook takes the pawn on g7, we will be able to checkmate the black king, very similar to the other position. And if instead the king will move to h5 as the pawn on the f file is blocked, then we will be able to take the pawn with our king, and the rook will have to sacrifice for the pawn. And after we win the rook, we also win the game as well. And here's our next position, white to move, find the best play. Assuming that you've thought about the position, let's go over it. Well, if you thought about rook to e1, this actually is not the correct play. The reason why, after king to f7, if you bring the king closer to d7, black is going to be able to get a draw because he's going to start a series of checks with his rook, and you're not going to be able to get away from them. After rook to a7, if you try to go to king to d8, well, he's going to check you again on a8. If you go with king to d7, he's going to come back to a7 check. If you go something king to d6, king to a6 check. And if you start coming towards the rook, let's say king to c7, rook to a7 check. If you attack the rook on b6, well, now the rook is able to take the pawn, and after you exchange it, this is a draw. So let's go back from the beginning. If you also thought about moving the king to d7 right away, this also leads into a draw, just because you will let black be able to start a series of checks again. After rook to a7, even though black's king is separated from the f file because of your rook, your king is still not going to be able to get any shelter. After king to e8 and rook to a8 check, your king cannot prevent black from checking him. You cannot shelter from his checks, so you'll be forced to come out again. King to d7, rook to a7, king to d6, rook to a6. Black is just going to constantly check you, and you will not be able to make any progress. If you move away from the pawn, let's say king to d5, the rook will simply keep checking you. Rook to a5 check, king to c6, rook to a6 check. And if your king comes to b7, not letting black check you again, the black rook will simply come behind the pawn now, and now this is a draw as well. So coming back from the beginning, the correct play here is rook to a1. An excellent move. This type of tactic is called deflection, because black has only two options, either to take your rook or trying to move his rook away. Well, if he takes your rook, you're simply going to promote on the next move, and now having the queen and the rook and king separated should be a pretty easy move. You're just going to keep checking the king until you get a fork, and you will be able to pick up that rook. And then coming back, if the rook will not take your rook but will come to e8, not letting that pawn promote, well, now your king will be able to attack that rook. If black is going to come to defend his rook, let's say king to f7, you're simply going to attack the king on f1, and now the king will have to move away, and you will be able to pick up the rook and also win the game from here. And if instead black is going to just move the rook away, well, you're just going to promote on the next move, and now black will have to sacrifice his rook, and you will be able to win the game with the other rook. And here's another example where deflection is to be used. Your king is cut off, so the king cannot help support his pawn, and if you just gonna wait with the rook defending your pawn, the black king will simply come towards the pawn and then be able to attack it with his rook and be able to take it. But if your king is just as far away from your pawn as his king, you can see in 2 moves you will be able to defend your pawn. It will take black 2 moves as well to attack your pawn, but you have the move. If your pawn is on the 7th rank, always look for ideas of deflection. So the correct move here again is rook to e7. After this, black has only 2 continuations. If he takes the rook, obviously we'll promote with check, and then we will be able to win from here. And if the rook will go to g8, just because you have the move, you will be able to go towards the pawn and you will get there before black. Black will come to g5, trying to prevent you from coming to defend your pawn, but you do have the square f7 available. So after your king goes there, rook will have to move away, from which you will promote on the next move and then win the rook from here. If you liked my video, please subscribe and don't forget to check out my new website, masteryourchess.com, where you can learn, practice, test, and master your chess knowledge.